which is we're going to take a look at second part of 802.11n, and in order to do that, I'm going to use a couple of AirMagnet tools to help visualize some of the concepts I'm talking about. Specifically, I'll look at some views from AirMagnet Spectrum XT and a very, very nice tool built into AirMagnet's Wi-Fi analyzer that helps us visualize throughput for different devices. The whole point of the conference, though, will be to look at some of the additional 802.11n enhancements. For instance, 20, 40 megahertz wide channels, additional subcarriers, short guard intervals, 5/6 coding rate, and frame aggregation with block acknowledgments. These are optional features built into 802.11n that may or may not be available depending on the channel aspects and characteristics, and these particular options can have a significant improvement on performance of your wireless LAN. So to understand how they work and when they get involved and things like that, we'll just take a quick look at those today. So I'm going to change my to the next slide, and this one will be just this is my desktop reference, so welcome to my world. This is where I spend most of my time reviewing these documents here, and this is 802.11 in a nutshell. This is the body of work that we use every day in the field, and here's what defines it. So as you can see, with the one 3-ring binder there labeled 802.11n 2009, that ratified amendment. I think we've got a little bit of open mic there, folks. If you wouldn't mind just muting your microphones for me, I'd appreciate it. So this 802.11n 2009 binder contains over 500 pages of new documentation, which came out in September 2009. And of course, today it's inundated our industry. We see 802.11n everywhere, and only more of it coming forward. Now, in our first discussion last February, we took a look at some of the 802.11n enhancements, and I went through quickly, and we focused at that time on the first one, upper left column under high throughput, where it says spatial division multiplexing, SDM, and we kind of focused on that. And we looked at the way that spatial division multiplexing, or spatial streams, additional spatial streams, can help an 802.11 wireless LAN association improve both for speed and distance, and that's what we looked at in the first one. So in this next one, part 2, I'd like to concentrate on the next 5 items just below spatial multiplexing: 20, 40 megahertz channels, additional subcarriers, optional short guard intervals, the new MCS coding rate of 5/6 coding rate, and then frame aggregation and block acknowledgments. So changing slides once more. This is a screenshot from AirMagnet's Wi-Fi analyzer. This is a tool found under the Wi-Fi tools section, and it's called the Device Throughput Calculator. What a great tool this is to allow us to do what-if scenarios, visualize different consequences of the 802.11n options. So we can come in here, and as you can see right here, I've set this up as a pretty basic model. I've gone into the device calculator. I've chosen from the MCS drop-down view a modulation coding scheme number 7. That equals a single stream, a single spatial stream. It uses 64 QAM, quadrature amplitude modulation, with a 5/6 coding rate. And that 5/6 coding rate is the new coding rate that became available only with 802.11n. So just quickly, a little bit about coding rates. What you should know about coding rates, when you see these, what look like fractions following a modulation level, what that stands for is the amount of error protection that has been built into the modulation. This happens at the phi layer, and it happens just before transmission. So what happens is a special algorithm will go through and actually rob bits from the data stream and use those bits as, think of it as parity checking. It's error correction. And by stealing bits away, we actually have less bits for actual user data, but we have more protection in a noisy environment. So if the equipment does a signal strength test, a clear channel assessment, and determines that the signal is above a certain level, a certain threshold, it will say, well, we better add this amount of error protection, and then it transmits the frame. Now, it doesn't stop there. It doesn't blindly just stop there. The receivers are constantly checking, and the transmitters are constantly checking and keeping track of their packet error rate as well. So this is in tandem with the coding rate. We also check and calculate the packet error rate, and that helps us determine whether we need more correction, whether we need less correction, whether we need less modulation, and things like that. So that's just, in a nutshell, a quick view on that. What the fraction stands for. Now, this isn't exactly right. This is coding for every bit that goes in, the number of parity bits that have to be added in order to protect this frame to recover it in case of a collision or noise in the environment. That's what that fraction stands for. If you think of it this way, it's just a quick shorthand way. If you see something like half-rate coding, what that means is for every 2 bits that are in the air, one of them is user data and one of them is a parity check bit. Think of it that way. That's a simplified view, but it's a quick way to realize what this is doing. For instance, if you had 2/3 coding rate, for every 3 bits transmitted, 2 of those are user data. 1 is a parity check. Same with 3/4 rate. So if you have 4 bits being transmitted, 3 of them are user data, and 1 has been stolen from the user data and is being used as a parity. And then with the new one, which came with the 802.11n, very powerful, out of each 6-bit sent, 5 of those bits are composed of user data, and a single one has been robbed from the user data to act as a parity forward error correction bit. Now, that's a simplified view, but it works, and it's not incorrect to think of it that way. Okay, so that's what that bit is, or that's what that number stands for. So looking down the list here, we've dropped this down, and I'm just going to use the different variables within this little calculator to help us view what happens when we turn on short guard interval, when we turn on 40 megahertz channels, what exactly is going to happen. So many of you are familiar with legacy, or I should say classical 802.11 methods, such as 802.11a, 802.11g, 802.11b, and like that. And you'll know, I think most of you probably know that the advertised physical data rate that we see transmissions going out as is really not the same as the actual throughput that we're going to receive on the receiving side. And the reason for that is because of all the overhead that it takes to get our user data transmitted. Part of that overhead is what I just talked about with the coding rate. So stealing a bit for coding is not a terrible amount of overhead, but there is a lot of other overhead in there as well. Someday, I hope we have time, I'd like to go through and talk about the diffs, the preamble, RTS, CIFs, and CTS, and the data and the acknowledgement, and show how all of these have an effect on our actual throughput of user data. But at this time, let's focus on some other things for this session. And I'd like you to show, take a look. We're looking at pretty much a 7-stream, 5/6 coding rate signal, and according to the calculator, we can see the maximum physical data rate is 6.5 megabits per second. The maximum throughput that you could get theoretically out of that would be 5.49 megabits per second. That accounts for about 15.5% of overhead. Well, we'd like to get that overhead down as much as possible so that we're transmitting almost entirely data. The more data we can send, the better. That's always a rule in networking. So that's what we're going to be looking at going up through these next few slides. Okay, so to move on, I would like to say that the max physical data rate, and this is something that we all have to contend with, is what you see and what your users see when they connect to an 802.11n access point. They go to their client utilities, they look at the status details of their connection, and they see this max physical data rate, which usually is quite far removed from what they're actually going to see for performance. So moving on, hope you can still hear me. Let's move this slide to the next one. Now here's some modulation coding rate charts that I've taken from some of my other materials. And in the upper left corner, we can see 802.11n modulation coding schemes for a single spatial stream. Upper right, you'll see another chart that has the same, has all the options. The only thing that really changes here is the MCS index number and the number of spatial streams. So in the upper right corner, you see all the options with 2 spatial streams. Back to the lower left, you'll see the same thing but with 3 spatial streams. Over to the lower right, you'll see the same options, but if you have the ability to enable up to 4 spatial streams. Today, that's pretty rare that you would have 4 spatial streams. In fact, it's only now becoming popular to see 3 spatial streams, the one on the lower left. But almost everybody has seen 2 spatial streams, the one on the upper right. So these are the different options. So let's take a quick look. Notice that the options are identified by an MCS index level. So the MCS index level of number 7 specifies 64 QAM with 5.6 coding rate on a single spatial stream, but there are additional options that you can enable. You can choose to have a 20 or a 40 megahertz channel. In our previous discussion, we talked about the use of 40 megahertz channels in 2.4 gigahertz and the problems with doing that, and we just pretty much make a blanket statement that it's not a good idea to try to put 40 megahertz channels in 2.4 gigahertz. There's just not enough bandwidth there. It's a better option to use in the 5 gigahertz unibands when possible. Okay, so if you have the option to enable 40 megahertz channels, we're going to take a look at some of the results of doing that. You can see here that our phi rate is going to go up almost by double, in fact, a little bit over double. Okay, so you may not have the option to use 20 megahertz channels, 40 megahertz channels, but if you can, that should improve your performance drastically. Another option that you have is the ability to use short guard interval or the standard guard interval, and we'll take a look at what that means too. Now that's not necessarily something you can manually control. Use of the short guard interval, you may be able to enable the ability, but you might and probably wouldn't want to have the choice each time we want to send a frame. Do I use short guard interval or do I not? We allow, in most cases, most vendors allow the chipsets to perform signal strength assessments and signal-to-noise ratio assessments and determine whether or not it's appropriate to go with short guard interval or not. And I'll try to show you why on just a couple of slides from now. Okay, let's move on to the next one, and that is from Spectrum XT. I took a quick shot of some activity on channel 36, 802.11a Uni 1 band, and wanted to lay this out for you. So here we have the Grand Plateau that I call it. It is the OFDM symbol. And the OFDM symbol is made up of many, many smaller modulation symbols that have all been modulated individually. I'll show you that in the next couple of slides. But what they do is they add together. It's an additive signal, and they transmit, and when you view them on the screen, you can kind of see this. You can see this plateau, and it usually has this little notch that bends down in the middle, and that's because the center of this is actually not populated with user data. So there's a null area right there at the very center called the DC subcarrier, and we'll take a look at that. On each side of the DC, split right across the center, is going to be the rest of the subcarriers that use that carry user data. Now I've got a couple terms here. So we're looking at channel 36, the center frequency 5.180 gigahertz, and we are seeing a standard 20 megahertz channel, which means that our signal strength, when we energize the center frequency, when we modulate all the subcarriers, we will occupy space from 5.170 to 5.190. That's a 20 megahertz channel. 802.11 rules say that when we reach the 10 megahertz above and 10 megahertz below the center frequency and using our modulation techniques, we have to either filter or some other form of attenuation to lower our signal by 1,000 times at those two edges to provide co-channel interference immunity. So that's what those less than 30 dB down labels are showing there right now. So just kind of keep this Grand Plateau in mind as we go to the next slide and take a look at how I've broken this down into a theoretical, actually more of an ideal format. This shows us pretty much that Grand Plateau, and it shows us how, when we construct an 802.11 OFDM type of a transmission, what happens is we take raw user data coming in on our bit stream, we feed it into a process that changes a serial stream into a parallel stream and then uses different modulation techniques and something called inverse fast Fourier transforms to divide the frequency space that we just saw into multiple subcarriers. Now, the type of OFDM, orthogonal frequency division multiplexing, that we use in 802.11 is known as OFDM 64, or 64-point OFDM. And that means that we break this down into 64 subcarriers. You can almost visualize these subcarriers as being separate narrowband transmitters. Okay, so that's a good way to think of it too. Of these 64 transmitters, using legacy 802.11a and G OFDM, the technique always reserved 6 subcarriers at the lower end of the channel and 5 subcarriers at the upper end of the channel, and the very center frequency, those were used for protection. We call those guard subcarriers. Now, we've got to be careful with that term because we use the term guard in 2 different ways, and I want to make sure you're clear on that. These are guard subcarriers. They create a guard band, and they help us to provide inter-channel interference immunity. So imagine channel 36 here, and now imagine channel 40 being adjacent to channel 36. And notice that channel 40 on its lower end would have 6 subcarriers that do not carry user data, and we have channel 36 with 5 carriers at its upper end that do not carry user data. Do you see that that is 11 carriers that are touching adjacent to each other that do not carry user data? And that's how we can have adjacent channels right next to each other and have a good degree of co-channel interference immunity, or I should say adjacent channel immunity. And so that's built right into OFDM. There's several things built into OFDM that are just amazing, and we want to take a further look at that as we go. Okay, so I said that DC, the direct current subcarrier, or direct conversion, whichever you prefer, is the center subcarrier. Okay, so when we build when OFDM builds a transmission, the center subcarrier is not populated. In addition, 4 additional subcarriers known as pilots are used as sounding tones. They're used as kind of let's call them what's a good term? I can't think of a term other than pilots, so let's use pilots. That's the best term for them. Okay, and they are in red. Now, all of the additional carriers that are left over, and there'll be 48 left, those can be modulated with one of the 4 types of modulation we use in 802.11. That could be binary phase shift keying, quadrature phase shift keying, 16 QAM or 64 QAM, depending on the channel characteristics. That determines what type of modulation will be used on each one of these subcarriers, and coincidentally has a direct effect on how much data gets carried over this. Each one of these little subcarriers is 312.5 kilohertz wide out of the 20 megahertz. So if you want to just check my math real quick, take 20 megahertz and divide it by 312.5 kilohertz, and I think you'll come up with 64 subcarriers. Of the 64, we've got 11 that are, actually 12 that are not used for user data. We've got another 4 set aside for pilots, and that leaves 48 subcarriers for user data. Now let's take a look at what happened with 802.11n. What they did was they said, they being the 802.11n task group, said we think that we can provide the same amount of adjacent channel interference with a few less subcarriers. So what they did was they have stolen back a couple of subcarriers. So now you see that on the lower end of an 802.11n HT, high throughput channel, we only have 4 subcarriers at the lower end and 3 subcarriers at the upper end. So we've taken back an additional 4 subcarriers. We still have our DC at center. We still have 4 pilots, but we have additional user-populated carriers, okay? So the channel hasn't widened, but we've just stolen back some of our guards, and in most cases, that's okay. It's usually still a good idea to not put an access point that's on channel 36 right next to an access point that's on channel 40 and vice versa. It's a good idea, since we have quite a few channels in 802.11a, to kind of skip. So if I was going to go 36 on the first access point, I would maybe jump the next one up to channel 44, and then the next one maybe would go up to channel 52, something like that, so that we have a little bit of additional immunity. But there is some immunity built right into the OFDM scheme. Moving on. Now, here's a look at the effect of basic, let's see. Okay, here's a 20 megahertz channel, MCS coding rate of 7. That means 64 QAM modulation with 5/6 coding rate. In this case, we're not using short guard interval. This is a 20 megahertz channel, and there are no legacy devices in the area, so no protection mechanisms. And you can see that that has improved over our first look. It has improved to a signaling rate of 65 megabits per second. Now, a lot of times I say signaling rate and phi rate. Those, in my terms, mean the same thing. Signaling rate is how many bits we transmit. That's not the same as throughput, which is how many of those bits we transmit are user data, not the aggregate, including the overhead. But notice in this case, we've got 18.5, a little better than 18.5% overhead, which reduces our theoretical throughput rate down to about 53 megabits per second. You're not likely to see 53 megabits per second, even though that might be theoretically possible, because in your environment, unless you have a clear environment, no other users around, no contention, a very low noise floor, and you're very close to your access point with your client devices, then you're not going to see these rates. But that's just giving us a ballpark number to work with, okay? So keep this in mind. And if you want a quick view, just look at the bright green area in the frame exchange picture, and you will get a quick view how much of our transmission is data and how much is other stuff that we have to make this work. Okay, and we call that overhead. All right, so that's just kind of a baseline right there. Let's move on and talk about the short guard interval, usually written as SGI, short guard interval. To understand that, let's take a look at the normal guard interval and what that is. A standard guard interval is built into 802.11 OFDM, so it's been there since 802.11a, 802.11g. The guard interval is a prepended area on the front of the OFDM modulated symbol that gets transmitted. The OFDM symbol, just a few minutes ago, we looked at the different subcarriers, and when we did, we were kind of looking at the frequency domain. Here, I'd like to have you try to switch over. Now we're talking about the time domain. There's a slight difference there, and it's sometimes hard to make that transition, but realize now we're talking about the time domain. This transmission occurs over 4 microseconds interval. Now, of that 4 microseconds of interval, OFDM, since the earliest days, has had the ability to protect itself from multipath fading by prepending the front of the transmission with redundant data that we don't care about, and then putting our important data following that. So we divide the OFDM symbol, which occurs over a 4 microsecond interval. We divide that into 2 areas. A 3.2 microsecond area, the one you see in green, which is our good user data, and a 0.8, 800 nanosecond interval at the front of the OFDM symbol as our guard interval. In other words, when we transmit this frame, really we transmit more than one frame, so when we transmit our first frame, no big deal. We transmit our second frame, we expect that I'm sorry, I'm talking about symbols here, not frames. When we transmit our second symbol, that transmission can spread out and take unexpected reflections and bounces throughout our environment. When that happens, the reflections may come in and also strike the receiver, but slightly out of phase, slightly out of time. And it's calculated depending on your environment, whether you're indoors, outdoors, in a warehouse, whether you're in an office. There are different types of delay spread intervals that can occur. So the 0.8 microsecond or 800 nanosecond interval on the guard interval is devised to give us the best protection against the most multipath fade in most conditions. Here is an example of how that would be. Now, let's see. This is a little bit confusing, so I've tried to break it out another way. Let me just quickly show you. So on the top here, underneath where it says OFDM symbol, I've got two OFDM symbols back to back. I also have the same symbols at the lower end of the bottom of the slide. Notice that at the top it's the transmitted signal, at the bottom is the received signal. So we've got two perfect OFDM symbols being transmitted. And then on the receiving side, we have those same two symbols being received, but with a delay spread that has affected our transmissions. Notice that the delay spread has occurred, the corruption has occurred within the guard interval, and that's perfect world. So we want that to happen. I'm going to try this. Let's see if this will work. There we go. Okay, so this is a very simple animation, just showing transmit, receive, transmit, receive, transmit, receive. So we transmit, but the prepended guard interval, by the way, that has another term in other types of wireless communications. That you won't frequently see it referred to as guard interval. In most cases, it's known as a cyclic extension or a cyclic prefix. So you'll see this in WiMAX, LTE, same deal, but they call it a CP rather than a GI. So this GI term is pretty much just in 802.11. But the guard interval here is fixed for standard 802.11, and the reason we're talking about it all is because in 802.11n, that can be adjusted. There's a single adjustment that can be made. But remember what the effect of changing the guard interval might be, and that might be more collisions, more corrupted frames due to multipath fading. Okay, so let me close that and go back to our slides. Okay, so that's delay spread. That's the reason for the guard interval. So in 802.11n, we have the ability to enable short guard interval. Usually you can turn on a checkbox. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be used all the time. The chipset will still make the final determination in most cases whether or not to shorten up the guard interval or not, and that's based probably on packet error rate. If the packet error rate is higher, then the assumption is probably be that you're getting a lot of multipath collisions or multipath fading, which is causing issues. So here's what happens when you enable short guard interval. Instead of having an 800 nanosecond guard interval, we can shorten it down to a 400 nanosecond, which means that we've got 3.6 microseconds now for user data. So we've gained 400 nanoseconds there of more user data that we can fit in there. So more data is good. That's the bottom line. So this is the HT short guard interval. Now let's see how that affects your user data by going into the device calculator. And in this case, notice here we've gone back to the variables. We're still using MCS7, 64 QAM, 5.6 coding rate, but now we've enabled the short guard interval on a 20 megahertz channel, still a greenfield environment. No 802.11a, G, B devices in the area, so we don't have to worry about protection mechanism overhead. Okay, so we're still on a 20 megahertz channel. SGI is enabled, and notice now that we have improved slightly our data rate. I'd like to go back. Let me try this. I hope this doesn't make anybody dizzy. I'm going to zip back to our previous slide. Okay, so without short guard interval, everything else is the same, 52.93 megabits per second. The overhead was only 18.5%. Now I'm going back and showing the overhead has increased 20.19% in this case, but the max PHY data rate improved and the max throughput improved. So overall, we have an improvement of user data, significant, over 5 megabits. And that is just by enabling short guard interval. Okay. So something that you may want to consider. But if you have a highly reflective environment like warehouses where you have a lot of metal, pallets full of metal cans, washing machines, that type of thing, maybe it's not the best choice to enable it. Although usually your chipsets makes the final decision. If you have a highly reflected environment, it's possible you don't want to enable that to begin with. All right, now let's talk about frame aggregation. This is another option that is built into 802.11n, which could be available to you. This is a little misleading because we really haven't seen much use of frame aggregation until 802.11n, but it's been available for a while now. It came out originally with another amendment. But with frame aggregation, there are two types of ways to aggregate frames. We can aggregate just the payload sections, or we can aggregate entire 802.11 frames. Now, if we aggregate just the payload sections, that is the higher layer user data payload section, we strip off the MAC header, we strip off the MAC trailer, and what's left is the payload, which would be layer 3 and higher information. We call that the MAC service data unit, and when we aggregate just payloads together with a single MAC header, then we call that AMSDU format. And the ability to use AMSDU format allows us to have a maximum frame size of about 8K. And by just turning on max frame size and enabling block acknowledgement, so to get the full benefit of using frame aggregation, we also want to be able to send a single acknowledgement to acknowledge multiple aggregated frames. So turn those two on usually in concert, and in this case still MCS 7, it's still the greenfield environment. We've turned SGI back off, got a 20 megahertz channel, but we've enabled AMSDU, and now notice the improvement in overhead. That went down significantly by almost about half, or a little better than half. And where we have a PHY data rate max of 65 megabits per second, we are beginning, in theory at least, to approach the throughput rate is approaching the PHY data rate. And that's possible, but only in an HT greenfield environment. Okay, moving to the next. The other way to aggregate frames is to take entire frames. That is, each frame has its own MAC header and trailer, the frame check sequence. It has its own payload, so it's a self-contained frame. In theory, this could actually have a different destination MAC address. You could have multiple frames with multiple addresses, theoretically at least. Okay, so MPDU, the protocol data unit, is the entire MAC layer protocol data unit, MPDU. And let's see what happens when we enable AMPDU. With AMPDU, the max frame size manages to increase up to about 64K. So that's significantly larger. Of course, you have to be able to support that in your 802.11 environment, and that's an effect of how many users you have associated to each one of the APs. It can also be affect how many other APs, including neighbor APs and clients, are in your immediate vicinity. But that's a topic for another session. So let's continue on with this. The only thing that's changed here, we're still MCS 7, no short guard interval, 20 megahertz channel, greenfield environment, but we're using MAC protocol data unit aggregation with block acknowledgments, and look at our overhead drops down to 1.32. Look at the bright green area. We're transmitting almost pure data in this method, so highly desirable, especially if you're in an environment where you're downloading or uploading or sending lots and lots of data frames, lots and lots of big information packets. Okay, we're coming very close. Max throughput is coming very close to max PHY data rate, at least in theory. Again, your mileage may vary in your environment. Okay, now let's take a look at the use of 40 megahertz channels and see what that does. So if you remember our Grand Plateau from earlier in the discussion where we took a 20 megahertz channel centered at our DC, now when you enable 40 megahertz channels, a lot of times that's referred to as channel bonding. And it's okay to visualize, and it's true, we actually take two channels, in this case channel 36 and channel 40, and kind of stick them together, and we're going to use all of the subcarriers, but we don't just, glue them together. Instead, we recalculate everything. So in other words, the OFDM frame, the OFDM transmitted symbol will now have a new center frequency. And that center frequency is right here in this case at 5.19 gigahertz. And from there, now we're going to have 20 megahertz above and 20 megahertz below that center frequency, and then we use an IFFT process to divide this into 128 subcarriers. So it's twice OFDM 64. We've got OFDM 128. In this case now, HT OFDM with a 40 megahertz channel devotes, we go back to the old standard, I guess you would say, we devote 6 null subcarriers at the lower end and 5 null subcarriers at the upper end. We still have, we have 6 pilots now, a total of 6 pilots, and we have 3 null subcarriers at DC, right in the center. So even though we have additional subcarriers that are not used for user data, the trade-out we're making by having all these additional subcarriers is tremendous. So we get over double. And I wanted to show you this so that you could understand why when you go from a 20 to a 40, how come you don't just get twice as much? How come you get better than twice as much? So if you kind of look at these slides, count them up, you'll see that we actually have more subcarriers available for user data now than we would have if we were just looked at 2 20 megahertz OFDM symbols. Okay? And you can see in front, I kind of zoomed in so you can see that a little better. Hope that's coming through. I hope you're able to see this okay. Okay, so that's a 40 megahertz channel. Let's see what that does in the throughput calculator. So now we've got MCS rate of 64 QAM, 5.6 coding rate, short guard interval, 40 megahertz channel. We're using AMPDU. I'm going to do several things here, and I wanted to have a baseline. So we'll use all of these same things, except I'm going to change the MCS coding rate. This is going to stay a greenfield environment. We can talk about protection mechanisms in an upcoming episode, but right now let's stay focused on this, and let's see what that does. So now, if you recall, let me go back 1, 2, right to here. I've gone back now. And I'm looking at MCS 7 with 20 megahertz channel. I think everything's the same. Did I enable SGI? So max PHY data rate of 65 megabits per second. Let me come forward. Yes, okay. So this is these are apples to oranges. Sorry about that. Short guard interval is enabled on this one, so it's not exactly the same. But notice the PHY data rate has changed to 150 megabits per second. Okay? Now, let's go forward with this next one. And here's what I wanted to do. Now, what happens when you add additional spatial streams? So everything here should be the same as the previous one. I'm going to slide back. We've got MCS 7 is the only thing that will change, 64 QAM, 5.6 coding rate, SGI on, 40 megahertz channel. We've got full frame aggregation in a greenfield environment, 150 meg with 2.96% overhead. Now we go to, we change up, we add another spatial stream. Basically, this is 2 by 2. And now it's MCS 15, and we're seeing that that doubles to a theoretical possible max PHY data rate of 300 megabits per second. And if we further increase this to MCS level 23 at a third spatial stream, let's say a 3 by 3, in this case now, up to 450 megabits per second. And those are beginning to appear on the market now. So it's no longer theoretical. These, in some cases, you can actually purchase from several companies. Mostly on the access point side, but there are some clients that are beginning to take advantage of this. I'm not sure they're on the shelf yet is all. So I'm not sure if we're actually seeing this. Even so, with 3 spatial streams, there are additional benefits out there, even to a device that only is capable of transmitting 2 spatial streams. And we talked on that briefly in part 1 of this. Okay, and one last one. Here is MCS level 31, a 4-stream session, I guess you would say, between a client and an access point. Could have a max PHY data rate, transmission rate of 600 megabits per second. Okay, and lots of other things we can do. Hopefully we'll get another chance to go through some of these and take a look at some of the other options. I think that is, yeah, that's the last one. Okay, so just to summarize, I wanted to give you a couple of tools that will allow you to visualize what happens when you enable different options in 802.11n. Because, you know, I've been talking since 2009, well, turn on short guard interval, turn on frame aggregation, things like that, but I wanted to show you what the theoretical effect could be. And the Wi-Fi analyzer tool called the Device Throughput Calculator, which is just one of the many tools in Wi-Fi Analyzer, that allows us to visualize and do what-if scenarios. There's a lot more things you could do. You could have what happens if I turn on an 802.11b device now. If a B guy comes into the area while you've got this going on, how does that affect you? Well, most of you know that protection mechanisms kick in, and it's going to drop everybody down significantly just by the B guy being present in the area. He doesn't even have to be actively performing data access methods. I also wanted to show you layer 1. I wanted to show you Spectrum XT, a capture of what an OFDM symbol transmission looks like. Okay. Then we looked at some of the optional 802.11n enhancements that we hadn't touched on previously, including 2040 megahertz channels, the additional subcarriers that were enabled because of 802.11n. We looked at what the short guard interval is, what the guard interval is, what the short guard interval means, and why it may or may not be beneficial in your environment. And we talked briefly about coding rate, the new one called 5.6 coding rate. Then we had a quick discussion on frame aggregation and block acknowledgments. And that pretty well filled up the hour, and we're currently coming up on the top of the hour, and I wanted to set aside just a few minutes to try to answer in case there's any questions there. I haven't checked, but I'm going to now. So thanks a lot for attending. I appreciate that, and it's always fun for me to be able to come out here and share my new slides, and it gives me a reason to make these new slides and materials, so I appreciate it. So keep coming back in the future. Hope to have even more information about some of my favorite 802.11 and wireless LAN topics. In the meantime, please visit me and the AirMagnet community out at airwisecommunity.com, and that is the forum where you'll see all aspects of wireless LANs discussed. If you have questions that haven't been addressed by me, then check in at info@airmagnet.com. And with that, let's take a look and see what we have, if there are any questions up here. I see from Gary and Neil. Let's see. I'm not seeing my standard panel, so maybe there are no questions. For some reason I'm not seeing. Usually there's a Q&A drop down. Okay. Sorry, folks, I hate to waste your time here while I thrash around, but I'm not exactly seeing the question and answer pop up. Oh, okay. Thank you for that, Joey. Let me try doing that. Let's do this. Okay. Very good. Yes, there are a few questions here. Sorry about that, folks. I get confused easily. I'm very, very focused on a single topic at a time. Let's see. Okay, some of these are standard housekeeping. Let's see if there's anything technical. Chet says, what is the power drain from 802.11n? Is it a problem for mobile devices for which battery life is a serious consideration? Chet, that's absolutely a concern for the mobile side because the mobile devices are running off batteries. The more radios you have, in other words, the more spatial stream capability you have, the more battery life you're going to suck down. And so it's definitely a consideration. Now, the use of 802.11n can use a single spatial stream, and many times you'll see the client devices using a single spatial stream to communicate to a multi-spatial stream capable access point. There are still additional benefits to doing that. Now, we discussed most of those benefits in the previous, the first episode, but I'd be glad to take offline if you have further questions about that. Okay, but just know that it's common to see a single spatial stream mobile device, especially a handset of some type, in order to conserve on battery life. But you still get some of the benefits of 802.11n. Multiple spatial streams coming from the access point can increase performance, but in addition to that, you may get further distances. In addition to that, you have power-saving features. You have many of the options that we talked about today. Hopefully that helps you. And Chet, lots of questions, Chet. I like that. How does bit robbing algorithm for error protection affect Wi-Fi delay? This is not a huge amount of delay. It's done at the PHY just before we send to the transmitter, and it's definitely not perceptible to the end user. So that's not something that would be seen. It could be calculated, but I doubt that you could measure it. Okay, so bit robbing happens very, very quickly. And I've got some other information. By the way, for everyone who's still here, I've got some very in-depth materials on how OFDM works. I did a tutorial several years ago called Understanding OFDM. And I've made that available off and on over the years. And it's my goal to republish that, represent that through the Airwise community. And I go pretty good detail, including how the coding mechanisms work, whether you're using trellis coding or how this actually works. We use convolution coding, and I kind of describe one way to view that in this Understanding OFDM. So check out at Airwise community for an announcement on that when we're ready to republish that. And I think you'll get some better details on how the bit robbing algorithm works, Jeff. And how does overhead relate to overhead percent? I noticed that 1/6 equals 16, which is close. Is that largely due to the bit robbing? Lots of numbers there, Chet. I'm going to take that question offline if you don't mind and try to contact or answer that on Airwise. I'm going to have to do some calculations on that to see if I come up with the same thing you're coming up, okay? But you have another one here. Is there a one-to-one correspondence between the number of spatial streams and the number of device antennas? Not necessarily. And that is because not all 802.11n access points will have a full transmit-receive radio for each one of the antennas. In many cases, they will use a less expensive receive-only radio on one of the antennas. and that helps us improve through spatial diversity, through transmit and receive diversity. Okay, so that's an additional thing, but it doesn't create a separate spatial stream. In order to have individual spatial streams, the radios attached to the antennas must be able to both transmit and receive, and they must be able to do it in synchronization with the other radios. So there's quite a bit more involved with that. So you can't just look at an access point, see 3 antennas and say, okay, 3 spatial streams. It may be. It may also be only capable of 2 spatial streams, but with maximal ratio combining involved and spatial multiplexing, spatial diversity, I should say. Okay, Mike, can you quick review the spatial stream concept? Are you saying each spatial stream is another OFDM 64 stream? I am saying that, yes. So, Mike, each one of these OFDM 64 streams is OFDM symbols being transmitted. And when we have multiple spatial streams, there's a couple ways that we can do it. We can either send out the same bit stream off of all the spatial streams. Now, that doesn't improve the throughput drastically, but it does improve the signal-to-noise ratio, giving us a more robust situation. In other words, a client device will be able to communicate from further away and possibly at a higher data rate than previously. So then there's the way that we can send out different OFDM 64 symbols on the different access points, the different spatial streams, and that would improve our performance drastically. So that's just a quick review, but we can talk more about that offline or on the Airwise community if you like. And another one from Chet. Let's see, you've been talking about throughput. Could you also step back and say a bit about reach? Yes, the distance of good Wi-Fi coverage. Yeah, Chet, that's a great one. We kind of covered that one on the Part 1 episode, and this deserves a good answer, but I'm going to skip over that one for now, and I'm going to ask you, let's see if we can get you a link so you can go back and review that first episode. And then let's talk about that either offline or on the Airwise community. Either one, I'm happy to do that with you, chat. Okay, Mike, let's see. After the guard interval and before the data area, there seems to be another space. After the guard interval, before the data area. You might be looking at that little white dotted line I put down there just to kind of give us a visual reference point. But remember, this is time domain, not frequency domain. It's kind of hard to imagine. But there should be no physical division between the GI and the data area. And is this just an intersymbol space that is fixed? And I think you must be talking about the GI. Intersymbol space is fixed. Mike, I'm going to ask for a little more information about that. And yes, Kurt, I just saw that pop up. And Joe and anyone from AirMagnet, can we put a link maybe on the Airwise community for that Part 1 of this series? Because I think that's a good point Kurt brings up. Here I am talking about Part 2, and some of these folks didn't even know about Part 1. So if we could make that available and let them know how to get to it, I'd appreciate that. Mark, I just saw yours. Let me get down through a couple more of these, and I'm going to come back. So, Chet, I managed to puzzle you, have I? So as you show each new scheme, SGI, the throughput increases, but the overhead is higher. What am I missing? And again, Chet, that's a good question. There is a lot of additional features in there. We really need to go in and talk about some other things that we haven't talked about previously that are sort of layer 2 issues. And I'm glad to talk about that. Maybe, though, that might be a good segue into a Part 3, because you're right, there's some stuff there that we haven't had a chance to discuss. It's not that you're missing them, it's just that we haven't covered all that. So this was kind of a shotgun presentation, try to wrap it up in oh boy, I see that we're running over my time. So I'm going to see if there's anything else here I can quickly answer. And Christopher, when you say chipset will determine which guard interval use, is that the wireless client or router's chipset? It would be whichever of those two devices, client or router, that is in the act of transmitting. Remember, only one device transmits at a time per channel. So whichever device is transmitting, doesn't matter if it's client, if it's 802.11n capable, or the access point, if it's 802.11n capable, that's what, just before it transmits, that's when it decides about that. And let's see, Gary. You're welcome, Gary. Let's see, Stephen, Zach. Thank you, Gabe. That's very nice of you to say that. Well, I don't know. I tell you what, just stick around. Maybe some of you will rub off on me too. Let's see. Okay, great questions. Folks, I'm sorry. We've run out of time. I guess I didn't leave enough time at the end of this. I wasn't expecting so many terrific questions. And I'm going to have to close this out because I promised to stay within my 1 hour, and I'm already running late. So please know that I will do my best to answer each and every one of these questions. Folks at AirMagnet have captured these questions. We're going to get back to you. It'll probably be through email, but also please feel free to check over on the Airwise community, and let's see if we can have share these questions and have a good discussion about all this. This stuff is fascinating to me, and I'm so happy to see that you seem to be interested in it too. So with that, thanks for joining me once more. The hour it wasn't long enough, and I hope to see you again real soon. Thank you.